This story starts off in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. After several prehistoric periods had passed, the early Bronze Age brought with it the region's first true civilization, a complex society characterized by advancements such as domestication, centralization, farming, architecture, and of course, writing. That civilization was Sumer, which consisted of groups of people who settled along the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Soon enough, cities started appearing, such as Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Umma, and Kish, just to name some of the bigger ones. The early dynastic period of Sumer, which started around 2900 BC, marked the appearance of kings who reigned over these cities, or to give them their Sumerian titles, Lugals. This is how it went for several centuries. The Sumerians were divided into city-states, each one with its own ruler, sometimes getting along, sometimes fighting with each other. But it was inevitable that one day one man would come along with grand ambitions of conquest and would succeed in bringing all the Sumerian cities under his control. And that man was Sargon, who appeared at the end of the 24th century BC and founded the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in history. It probably will not surprise you to discover that the life of Sargon is one big mystery to us. There is only one historical source that we can consider to be somewhat contemporary to him, and it's an ancient cuneiform text called the Sumerian King List, which has actually been found repeated on multiple artifacts in various states of preservation. The most complete version is on the Weld Blundell Prism, a tablet that sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Dated to around 1800 BC, it was still made almost 500 years after Sargon's time, but that's about as good as we are going to get. As its name suggests, the Sumerian King List is a list of, well, Sumerian kings, but it can hardly be considered completely factual. The kings of the first dynasties were seen as demigods and were credited with reigns that lasted hundreds, even thousands of years, and some dynasties, like that of the city of Lagash, were left off altogether. For example, the first king mentioned on the list is Alulim, who reigned over the city of Eridu, which might be the oldest city in Mesopotamia. The text said, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. So you can see why scholars might be disinclined to take it at face value. As far as Sargon was concerned, the text said, then Uruk was defeated and the kingship was taken to Akkad. In Akkad, Sargon, whose father was a gardener, the cupbearer of Ur-Zababa, became king, the king of Akkad, who built Akkad. He ruled for 56 years. This would place Sargon's reign between 2335 and 2279 BC, although there are multiple chronologies used by scholars and there is no exact consensus on those dates. Because of his power and success, Sargon became an important figure to the Babylonians and Assyrians who came after him, and they wrote multiple accounts about his exploits. Although these were written well over 1,000 years after Sargon's death, and they were almost certainly legendary, they are what we have to go on, and scholars reluctantly accept them on the basis that they were likely derived from much older Akkadian sources that are now lost, which probably had some kernels of truth in them. Going by these legends, Sargon's rise to power should be credited to the goddess Inanna, who was the Sumerian goddess of love and beauty, but also of war. Oddly enough. In text, Sargon always praised Inanna and claimed that he was under her divine protection. In turn, he helped transform her from a minor deity into one of the most important gods of ancient Mesopotamia. She would be later worshipped by the Babylonians and the Assyrians under the name Ishtar. Sargon even had one of his high priestesses named Enedwana compose hymns about Inanna. And here are two notable facts about Enedwana. Number one, she is identified as the daughter of Sargon, although we're not sure if this was simply a title or meant an actual blood relative, and two, living almost 4,300 years ago, she is usually considered the earliest author in history who is identified by name. Back to Sargon though, well, his birth and childhood are described in a Neo-Assyrian text that has partly survived. It said, Sargon the mighty king, king of Akkad am I. My mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. My brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azupiranu, which is situated on the banks of the Euphrates. My changeling mother conceived me. In secret, she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes with bitumen. She sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, lifted me out as he dipped his ewer. Aki, the drawer of water, took me and his son and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. When I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love. This is one translation. There are others, and while they vary slightly, they get the same message across. In this case, his changeling mother refers to her being a high priestess. While there are undoubtedly mythical elements to this origin story, there are also parts which are accepted as plausible facts about Sargon's life. For starters, that his birthplace was Azapuranu, a town situated somewhere on the banks of the Euphrates, whose exact location remains a mystery. Further, that he was the son of a gardener, and he may or may not have been adopted after being abandoned by his birth mother. Of course, it is also possible that none of this is true, and some scholars have argued that Sargon intentionally gave himself a modest upbringing to turn him into a man of the people character, contrasting the Sumerian kings who all glorified their bloodlines and royal lineages. Assuming that these antediluvial texts have some sort of truth to them, we move on to another crucial part of Sargon's life, the time when he took power. The story comes from a different source and takes place an uncertain number of years after Sargon was found and raised by a gardener named Aki, although this text identifies Sargon's father as Lai-Bum. Under unknown circumstances, Sargon had become the cupbearer of King Ur-Zababa, ruler of the Sumerian city of Kish. Ur-Zababa is also mentioned in the Sumerian king list, so at the very least we have some confirmation that he actually existed. For some reason he could not put into words, the king was scared of Sargon. According to the text, he became frightened in his residence. Like a lion, he urinated, sprinkling his legs, and the urine contained blood and pus. He was troubled. He was disturbed like a fish living in brackish water. One day, he saw Sargon sleeping and groaning in his sleep, indicating that he was having a vivid dream or perhaps a vision. Ur-Zababa had the cupbearer brought to him and told him to describe his dream. Truthfully, Sargon said that Inanna had appeared to him as a young woman, as high as the heavens and as broad as the earth, and then she drowned the king in a river of blood. This was perhaps not the smartest thing to admit to King Ur-Zababa, who now wanted Sargon dead, but he did not want to do the deed himself, maybe out of fear that he might be punished by the gods. Instead, he sent Sargon to a temple named Isakil to deliver a bronze mirror to the chief smith. There, the smith had orders to throw both Sargon and the mirror into the molds of his statues. Sargon did as he was told, but goddess Inanna intervened and stopped him from entering the temple. Instead, he only went as far as the gate and left the mirror there and then returned to the palace. A few days later, the king sent Sargon to the city of Umma with a message for King Lugal-Zej-Si. Unbeknownst to Sargon, the message simply said to kill the person who delivered it. And you want to know what happens next? Well, your guess is as good as ours. Frustratingly, the rest of the legend just didn't survive, so we don't know. There's just a few bits and pieces, but not enough to tell the whole story. We're not sure how Sargon survived this encounter and then managed to usurp power from King Ur-Zababa, but, well, he totally did. We should have a quick mention here of Lugal-Zaghazi. Although he started as king of Umma, he conquered multiple Sumerian cities such as Uruk, Lagash, Ur, and even Kish. At one point, his kingdom stretched out over most of Sumer, and he did this before Sargon, so some scholars argue that he should be the one with the claim to the First Empire. It all boils down to what we consider to be the differences between a kingdom and an empire, especially in the context of the ancient world over 4,000 years ago when cultural identities were not so well defined. A kingdom is homogeneous. Its size is not that important, but it consists of a people who share a history, a language, and a culture. All the people that Lugal-Zaghazi conquered were Sumerians, so it would probably be correct to say that he ruled over a large kingdom rather than an empire. Meanwhile, Sargon also went next door and conquered his neighbors, most notably the Elamites. His dominion was undoubtedly a multi-ethnic affair and would count as an empire by any modern definition, regardless of the actual title he used. According to the legend of Sargon, he was the one who founded the city of Akkad, also spelled Agade, which would go on to serve as the capital of his empire. It was also the birthplace of the Akkadian language, which is one of the oldest Semitic languages in the world. It was similar to other East Semitic languages, but unsurprisingly, it was also heavily influenced by Sumerians, since the Akkadians adopted the cuneiform writing of their neighbors. Akkadian became the most common language in Mesopotamia for around 1,800 years, being adopted by the later Babylonian and Assyrian empires, until eventually getting passed out in favor of Old Aramaic. As far as the city itself is concerned, scholars are convinced that it genuinely existed. It has been referenced in hundreds of other sources, most of them in cuneiform. However, the location of Akkad remains a mystery. At the moment, it is considered a lost city, but archaeologists do have some ideas on where it could have been, so it would not be too surprising if the ruins of Akkad would be uncovered sometime in the future. At that point, the discovery of new Akkadian artifacts would probably shed some more light on Sargon himself, but for now we make do with what we have. And one important source is the tablets from Nippur, which are old Babylonian artifacts recovered over 100 years ago from the ruins of the Sumerian city of Nippur, located in modern-day Iraq. Like all Babylonian artifacts, they were made centuries after the death of Sargon and the fall of his empire, but they contained copies of inscriptions which were once part of Akkadian statues located in the temple dedicated to the god Enlil. Not only do these inscriptions talk about Sargon's rise to power, but also about the later conquests of his successors. Omitting all the royal titles and the self-congratulatory talk that is always present in these kinds of monuments, here is what the tablets have to say about Sargon. Sargon, king of Akkad. He conquered the city of Uruk and tore down its walls. He challenged Uruk in battle and took Lug-alzaghazi, the king of Uruk, prisoner in the course of battle. He led him in a wooden collar to the gate of Enlil. Sargon, king of Akkad, challenged Ur in battle and defeated the city and destroyed its walls. He defeated En-in-Kamara and destroyed its walls and destroyed its land from Lagash to the sea. He washed his weapons in the sea. He challenged Umar in a battle and he defeated the city and destroyed its walls. To Sargon, king of the land, Enlil gave no rival. Enlil gave him the upper sea and the lower sea. From the lower sea, citizens of Akkad held the government. Mari and Elam were subject to Sargon, king of the land. He restored Kish and let them occupy the city. The message actually ends with a curse, saying that whoever will damage this inscription may Shamash tear out his roots and destroy his seed. As you can see, not a lot of detail there, but it does provide some useful information regarding the size of Sargon's empire and some of the main cities that became a part of his domain. What's interesting is Kish, the city that Sargon once called home when he was the king's cupbearer. It doesn't say that the Akkadian ruler conquered it in battle, but rather that he restored it and that he allowed its former inhabitants to live in the city. Although by no means a certainty, it is feasible that Sargon somehow usurped the throne of Kish, then used its resources to found the city of Akkad and amass a military powerful enough to conquer Sumer, one city at a time. Speaking of conquest, Sargon was not finished once he had the whole of Sumeria under his control. Since nobody in the region could match his power, he began expanding into new lands. Perhaps his most noteworthy foreign foe was Elam to the east, a civilization that would remain a powerful threat in the area for thousands of years. At that point, it was ruled by the Owan dynasty, but around 2300 BC, Sargon conquered its capital, Susa, and deposed King Lur-ishan. From inscriptions, we know that in the east, Sargon also fought and bested Parashum, better known under its Sumerian name, Mahashi. The existence of this settlement was first attested in Akkadian sources, and just like Akkad, today Mahashi is a lost city whose location remains unknown. However, it appears that the distance between it and the heart of the empire made it difficult for the Akkadian king to maintain control over it, and it was the source of frequent revolts which had to be put down by Sargon and the rulers who came after him. Even so, it could have been worse, as not all cities targeted by the king ended up a part of the Akkadian Empire. Some of them were simply destroyed, like Kazaloo. Today, Kazaloo is nothing more than the name of a city that supposedly existed once somewhere in Mesopotamia. We don't know what they did to earn the fierce ire of Sargon, but according to a Babylonian tablet, he pretty much wiped the city off the face of the earth. He marched into Kazaloo and turned Kazaloo into a ruined heap so that there was not even a perch for a bird left. Further up north, Sargon captured cities located in modern-day Syria, such as Mari, Tutul, and Ebla. According to one Babylonian narrative titled King of Battle, Sargon went so far north that he entered Anatolia, a peninsula which is today part of Turkey. There he conquered the city-state called Purashanda, which was reigned over by a king named Nur-dagal, who humbly accepted Akkadian rule and recognized the superior might of Sargon. The same account also claims that Sargon then sailed the Mediterranean Sea and captured Kaptara, which is probably Cyprus. Some scholars consider this last chronicle to be entirely fictional. While the full reach of the Akkadian Empire is uncertain, many believe that it did not extend northwest of the Euphrates. However, if it is indeed genuine, then Sargon's empire stretched out significantly further than one would even think possible at the time. As the conquests kept coming, Sargon began learning a lesson that many other rulers would have to learn after him. The more you expanded your empire, the harder it became to keep it that way. It is said that he installed governors in every new conquered city, the citizens of Akkad as they were called. As their name implies, spies, they were all from Akkad, but they also all spoke Akkadian, helping to spread the language throughout the region and turning it into the lingua franca of Mesopotamia for almost 2,000 years. That being said, this was still not enough. Even the sources that praise Sargon still make mention of numerous revolts and riots that he had to contend with throughout his reign and well into his old age. This is described by the Chronicle of Early Kings. Afterwards, all of the lands rebelled again and surrounded him in Agade. Sargon went out to fight and brought about their defeat. He overthrew them and overpowered their extensive army. Afterwards, Sabatu attacked Sargon in full force and called him to arms. Sargon set an ambush and completely defeated them. He overpowered their extensive army and sent their possessions into Akkad. The same chronicle also said that Sargon's actions angered the god Marduk, who then cursed him with insomnia and brought about a famine that destroyed his people, which in turn led to more rebellions. Despite the numerous uprisings, Sargon always came out on top, at least according to all the chronicles. However, they were written in his honor, after all, so it would have been unlikely that they would include his failures, but at the very least we can say that nobody rose up to pose a serious threat to his empire, not yet anyway. Furthermore, going by all the available evidence, Sargon had a very long reign. The Sumerian king list says 56 years, and while there are modern chronologies that argue for a lower number, they still say that his reign lasted for over 40 years. It is generally believed that Sargon died of natural causes given his old age, but we can't attest to that with any certainty. After his death, the Akkadian Empire lasted for around another 140 years. He was succeeded by his son Rimush, who had to contend with numerous revolts that, unsurprisingly, appeared after the demise of Sargon. His reign lasted less than a decade, and presumably he had no viable heirs upon his death because Rimush was succeeded by his brother, another son of Sargon named Manashtutsu. He was followed by his own son Naram-Sin, who gave himself the title of King of the Four Quarters of the Earth and brought the Akkadian Empire to the peak of its power. But after the peak, of course, there is nowhere to go but down, and the death of Naram-Sin marked the beginning of the downfall of the Akkadian Empire. Eventually, the dynasty was toppled by the Guti or Gutians, a group of tribes that descended from the Zagros Mountains upon the fertile fields provided by the Tigris and Euphrates. They started with frequent raids and other hit-and-run tactics that not only crippled the Akkadian Empire, but did not provide it enough time to respond. Eventually, the Gutians charged Akkad and laid waste to it, so that even today, we don't know where it's located. There is a reason why some scholars divide the history of ancient Mesopotamia into the pre-Sargonic and post-Sargonic eras. Before him, the region mainly consisted of city-states. Sure, they still warred with each other, and some kingdoms expanded their borders well beyond their original cities, but the idea of conquering and controlling the entire region was considered unachievable. After Sargon, though, this became the goal for many ambitious civilizations. First came the aforementioned Gutians, then there was the Sumerian dynasty, this time centered around the city of Ur, although it was also short-lived. Afterwards, there was a millennium where the Assyrians and the Babylonians swapped regional supremacy between each other several times before both were subdued and conquered by the new Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great. His Persian Empire lasted for a few hundred years before it also fell, this time to the Macedonian might of Alexander the Great. The size of empires grew even larger, as did the ambitions and lust for power of their rulers who wanted to conquer the world. But it all started with Sargon of Akkad. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.